This is a work of fiction created for entertainment purposes. Before we begin, tell us in the comments where you're watching from. It is always fascinating to see how far these stories can reach. In the autumn of 1963, the Arkansas State Police received an anonymous letter that would forever change how law enforcement viewed one of the most isolated counties in the Ozark Mountains. The letter, written on yellowed paper in careful handwriting, contained only 2 sentences. Sheriff Ambrose Kittredge is not who you think he is. Check the basement of the old Hartwell place on Copperhead Ridge. The letter was unsigned, postmarked from Little Rock, but investigators would later determine it had been mailed from a post office nearly 200 miles from the sender's actual location. Newton County, Arkansas, sits deep in the Ozark Mountains, a region where rugged limestone bluffs rise like ancient sentinels above narrow valleys carved by spring-fed creeks. In 1963, the county had fewer than 6,000 residents scattered across 423 square miles of dense forest, rocky hills, and isolated homesteads connected by winding gravel roads that seemed to disappear into the wilderness. It was the kind of place where neighbors lived miles apart, where the sound of a car engine carried across valleys, and where everyone knew everyone else's business, or thought they did. The county seat, Jasper, consisted of a courthouse square surrounded by a handful of businesses: Crow's General Store, Bunting's Texaco Station, the First National Bank of Newton County, and Moorcock's Diner, where the coffee was strong and the conversation centered on weather, politics, and who had been seen coming or going from which remote holler. The courthouse itself was a modest 2-story brick building constructed in 1908, with tall windows that overlooked the square and a clock tower that chimed every hour, its sound echoing across the hills even on the stillest days. Sheriff Ambrose Kittredge had served Newton County for 20 years, since 1943, when he returned from the Pacific Theater with a Bronze Star and a reputation for quiet competence. He was a tall, lean man with graying hair and pale blue eyes that seemed to see everything and judge nothing. The residents of Newton County trusted him implicitly. Crime was virtually non-existent under his watch. Property disputes were settled with a handshake and his mediation, and the few troublemakers who drifted through the area quickly moved on after a conversation with the sheriff. Local business owners spoke of him with respect that bordered on reverence, often saying that Sheriff Kittredge's presence alone was enough to keep order in the county. Kittredge had been born in Newton County in 1919, the son of a timber foreman who had worked for the lumber companies that cleared vast sections of the Ozark forest in the early part of the century. His youth had been spent in various logging camps, moving with his father's work assignments, learning the geography of the mountains and the characters of the men who made their living from the land. When he graduated from high school in 1937, he had briefly worked for the Civilian Conservation Corps, helping to build trails and fire roads in what would later become the Buffalo National River, before joining the Army in 1940, 3 years before his county would call him to serve as sheriff. The war had changed Ambrose Kittredge, though no one in Newton County could say exactly how. He had served with distinction in the Pacific Theater, participating in campaigns across multiple islands, witnessing and participating in levels of violence that were rarely discussed in polite society. When he returned home in late 1943, having been wounded and discharged with honors, he was quieter than before, more thoughtful, but also more decisive. When the longtime sheriff, Ezekiel Moorcock, announced his retirement in early 1943, citing health problems and a desire to spend time with his grandchildren, the county commissioners had unanimously appointed Kittredge to fill the position. The anonymous letter arrived at the state police headquarters on a Tuesday morning in October, when the maple trees along the Buffalo River were turning brilliant shades of red and gold. Detective Cyrus Hartwell, no relation to the family mentioned in the letter, was assigned to investigate. Hartwell was a methodical man in his 40s, raised in Little Rock, but with enough experience in rural counties to understand the delicate dynamics of small communities. He knew that an investigation into a beloved local sheriff would have to be handled carefully, quietly, and with absolute certainty before any accusations were made. Detective Hartwell had graduated from the University of Arkansas in 1939 with a degree in criminology, one of the first offered by the state university system. He had worked his way up through the ranks of the state police, developing a reputation for thoroughness and discretion that made him valuable for sensitive investigations. His assignment to the Newton County case came with explicit instructions from his superiors. Determine the credibility of the allegations without creating unnecessary controversy or damaging the reputation of a decorated war veteran and respected public servant. The Hartwell place mentioned in the letter had been abandoned for over a decade. Built in the 1920s by a timber company supervisor named Josiah Hartwell, the house sat on a remote section of Copperhead Ridge, accessible only by a narrow dirt road that wound through thick stands of oak and hickory. Josiah Hartwell had left Newton County in 1952 after his wife died in what was ruled an accidental drowning in their farm pond. The official report stated that Meridian Hartwell had slipped on wet stones while feeding the ducks, struck her head, and drowned in less than 3 feet of water. Sheriff Kittredge had investigated the incident personally and found no evidence of foul play. Josiah Hartwell had been something of an outsider in Newton County, having arrived from Tennessee in the 1920s to oversee timber operations for the McCloskey Lumber Company. He had built his house on Copperhead Ridge because the elevated position provided views of the surrounding forest, allowing him to monitor logging activities across multiple sites. The house had been substantial for its time and location, featuring running water from a deep well, a modern kitchen, with a gas stove supplied by propane tanks, and even a telephone line that connected to the company's communication network. Meridian Hartwell had been the daughter of a local family, the Crenshaws, who had farmed a small plot in the valley below Copperhead Ridge for 3 generations. Her marriage to Josiah had been considered advantageous by her family as it provided financial security and social standing that came with being married to a company supervisor. However, neighbors later recalled that the marriage had seemed strained in the months before Meridian's death, with Josiah working longer hours and spending more time away from home, while Meridian had become increasingly isolated and withdrawn. Detective Hartwell drove to Newton County on a gray October afternoon, telling local officials only that he was following up on some routine paperwork regarding old property records. Sheriff Kittredge welcomed him warmly, offering coffee and conversation in his modest office above the county courthouse. The sheriff's office was sparse but comfortable, with a wooden desk that had seen decades of use, filing cabinets that locked with heavy brass keys, and a window that looked out over the town square where elderly men gathered each morning to discuss weather and politics. The office walls were decorated with certificates from law enforcement training courses, commendations from various civic organizations, and photographs documenting Sheriff Kittredge's military service and community involvement. A gun case in the corner held several rifles and shotguns, all properly secured and maintained according to regulations. The overall impression was of a professional, dedicated public servant who took his responsibilities seriously and had earned the respect of his community through years of honest service. During their conversation, Detective Hartwell mentioned that he was researching the Hartwell property for a potential buyer, a lie that came easily after years of investigative work. Sheriff Kittredge's demeanor remained friendly, but something subtle shifted in his pale blue eyes. He mentioned that the property was isolated, difficult to access, and probably not suitable for development. He suggested that the detective might find better options in other parts of the county, places with better road access and fewer complications. Sheriff Kittredge spoke about the Hartwell family with what seemed like genuine sympathy. describing Josiah as a hard-working man who had been devastated by his wife's unexpected death. He explained that the drowning had been particularly tragic because Meridian had been an excellent swimmer, having learned as a young woman in the creeks and swimming holes around her family's farm. The sheriff's account of the investigation was detailed and professional, noting that he had personally examined the scene, interviewed potential witnesses, and consulted with the county coroner to ensure that all possibilities had been considered. According to Sheriff Kittredge, the morning of Meridian's death had been unusually foggy with heavy dew making all surfaces slippery and treacherous. Josiah had been in town on business, leaving Meridian alone at the house with instructions to feed the ducks in their farm pond before he returned. When he arrived home in the early afternoon, he had found her floating face down in the water, apparently having fallen, and struck her head on the stone edge of the pond. The sheriff had arrived within an hour of being called, and his investigation had found no evidence of struggle, no indication of foul play, and no reason to suspect anything other than a tragic accident. That evening, Detective Hartwell drove to Copperhead Ridge alone. The dirt road was barely wide enough for his sedan, and low-hanging branches scraped against the roof as he climbed higher into the hills. The road had obviously not been maintained since the Hartwell family's departure, with erosion creating deep ruts and fallen trees requiring careful navigation around washouts and obstacles. Several times the detective had to stop and move branches or rocks that blocked his path, and he began to understand why Sheriff Kittredge had suggested that the property would be unsuitable for development. The Hartwell house appeared suddenly around a sharp curve, a two-story frame structure with a sagging front porch and broken windows that reflected the last light of day like dark, watching eyes. Behind the house, a barn leaned at a precarious angle, its roof partially collapsed, and its walls weathered to a silvery gray. The property showed clear signs of abandonment and neglect, with weeds growing through the porch boards, shutters hanging at odd angles, and ivy covering much of the exterior walls. Detective Hartwell walked around the property as darkness fell, using a flashlight to examine the buildings and surrounding area. The farm pond where Meridian Hartwell had died was still visible, though partially filled with sediment and overgrown with cattails and water lilies. The stone edge that had allegedly caused her fatal head injury was cracked and moss-covered, making it easy to imagine how someone could slip and fall, especially in foggy, wet conditions. The basement of the house was accessed through a set of concrete steps that descended from the kitchen. The wooden door at the bottom was secured with a padlock that had rusted almost solid over the years. Detective Hartwell had brought bolt cutters, and the lock gave way with a sharp crack that seemed to echo through the empty house. The basement was larger than the footprint of the house above, extending under what had been the back porch and part of the yard, creating an unusually spacious underground area for a rural home of that period. What Detective Hartwell found in that basement would haunt his dreams for the rest of his life. Against the far wall stood a workbench with tools arranged in precise rows, each one cleaned and oiled as if it had been used recently. The tools ranged from common carpentry implements to more specialized instruments that seemed designed for delicate, precise work. Some appeared to be modified versions of standard tools, altered in ways that suggested specific purposes that Detective Hartwell preferred not to contemplate too deeply. Next to the workbench, a wooden cabinet contained what appeared to be medical instruments, some recognizable as standard surgical tools, others of unknown purpose, but clearly designed for intricate manipulation of organic tissue. The instruments were arranged with the same obsessive precision as the tools, each one cleaned and maintained with obvious care. In separate drawers, Detective Hartwell found supplies that might have been used for preservation or preparation of organic materials, including chemicals and compounds that would not normally be found in a rural basement, But it was the wall itself that made the detective's hands shake as he held his flashlight steady. The limestone wall had been carved with symbols, words, and drawings that created a horrifying chronology of violence. Names were etched into the stone, followed by dates stretching back to 1944, just 1 year after Sheriff Kittredge had taken office. Next to each name was a detailed description of suffering, written in the same careful handwriting as the anonymous letter that had brought Detective Hartwell to this place. The wall was a confession, a record, and a testament to 20 years of hidden brutality. Each entry was dated and signed with the initials A.K. Adolly, and many included additional notations that described techniques, reactions, and refinements to methods. The overall impression was of someone conducting methodical experiments, carefully documenting results, and making adjustments based on experience. The clinical, detached tone of the entries was perhaps more disturbing than graphic descriptions of violence would have been. Among the names carved into the wall, Detective Hartwell recognized several missing persons cases that had never been solved. Many were drifters, people passing through the county who had simply vanished without a trace. These transients had been easy targets, individuals whose absence would not be immediately noticed and whose disappearances could be attributed to the natural movement of people seeking work or opportunity in other locations. But some entries referred to locals, people whose disappearances had been explained as voluntary departures or tragic accidents. Meridian Hartwell's name was there, with a date of August 15, 1951, and details that contradicted every official record of her death. According to the wall carving, Meridian had discovered something that made her suspicious of Sheriff Kittredge's activities, and her death had been carefully staged to look like an accident while her husband was away and unable to provide an alibi or witness testimony. Another local name on the wall was Abilene Morse, a woman in her 30s who had supposedly left Newton County in 1955 to care for sick relatives in Missouri. According to the carved record, Abilene had been asking questions about missing transients, particularly about a man named Wendell Taggart, who had been doing odd jobs around the county before vanishing in the spring of 1954. Abilene's concern for Taggart's welfare had apparently attracted unwanted attention from Sheriff Kittredge, leading to her elimination and the creation of a cover story about family obligations in another state. Detective Hartwell photographed everything, using multiple rolls of film to document the walls, the tools, and the meticulous records of violence. The basement was cold and damp, with a musty odor that seemed to penetrate his clothing and hair. As he worked, he became increasingly aware of the sounds around him, the creaking of the old house settling, the rustle of wind through broken windows, and occasionally what sounded like footsteps on the floor above, though he was certain he was alone in the building. The photographs revealed details that were not immediately apparent to the naked eye. Some of the wall carvings included small diagrams and sketches that appeared to show anatomical structures and pressure points, suggesting that Sheriff Kittredge had possessed detailed knowledge of human physiology and had used this information to maximize suffering while minimizing the risk of accidental death before he was ready for his victims to die. Other carvings indicated that Sheriff Kittredge had been experimenting with psychological manipulation as well as physical violence. Several entries described techniques for inducing terror and despair, methods for breaking down resistance and hope, and observations about how different personality types responded to various forms of intimidation and coercion. The overall impression was of someone who viewed human suffering as both an art form and a science, constantly seeking to refine his techniques and expand his understanding of human limitations. In addition to the wall carvings, Detective Hartwell found personal items hidden in wooden boxes beneath the workbench. These included jewelry, identification papers, personal photographs, and small mementos that belonged to the people named on the wall. Each box was carefully labeled and organized, with items sorted by victim and date. The preservation of these trophies suggested that Sheriff Kittredge derived ongoing satisfaction from remembering his crimes and possibly reliving the experiences through examination of these physical reminders. One box contained items that appeared to belong to Meridian Hartwell, a wedding ring, a locket with a photograph of her parents, and a diary that documented her growing suspicions about her husband's frequent absences and strange behavior. The diary entries revealed that Meridian had noticed inconsistencies in Josiah's stories about his work schedule and had begun to wonder why so many transient workers seemed to disappear shortly after encountering the local sheriff. The diary also indicated that Meridian had discovered tools hidden in their barn, implements that seemed designed for purposes other than farming or timber work. She had confronted Josiah about these discoveries, but he had dismissed her concerns and suggested that she was becoming paranoid and unstable. The final entry in the diary was dated 3 days before her death and expressed fear for her safety and uncertainty about whom she could trust with her suspicions. In a locked drawer of the workbench, Detective Hartwell discovered journals written in Sheriff Kittredge's distinctive handwriting, documenting his thoughts and methods with the clinical detachment of a scientist recording experiments. The journals spanned nearly 2 decades and showed a clear progression from impulsive violence to carefully planned and executed murders. The early entries were brief and somewhat disorganized, suggesting someone who was still learning to understand and control his impulses. Later entries became increasingly sophisticated, with detailed discussions of timing, location selection, victim psychology, and cleanup procedures. Sheriff Kittredge had apparently studied law enforcement techniques and forensic science to better understand how crimes were investigated and solved, using this knowledge to avoid detection and eliminate evidence. The journals revealed someone who took pride in his ability to deceive colleagues and superiors while maintaining his reputation as an exemplary public servant. The journals also documented Sheriff Kittredge's psychological evolution, showing how he had gradually come to view his position of authority not as a responsibility to protect and serve, but as an opportunity to identify and access potential victims. He had used his badge and uniform to gain trust, his knowledge of the county's geography to identify isolated locations, and his control over criminal investigations to cover up his own activities. Reading the journals, Detective Hartwell began to understand the true genius of Sheriff Kittredge's deception. He had used his position and reputation to investigate his own crimes, carefully controlling the narrative and ensuring that any evidence pointed away from him. When questions arose about missing persons, Sheriff Kittredge was always the first to respond, the most thorough in his investigation, and the most convincing in his explanations for why people had left the county voluntarily or met with accidental deaths. The journals described specific techniques for manipulating crime scenes, coaching witnesses, and influencing the conclusions of coroners and medical examiners. Sheriff Kittredge had apparently studied the psychology of investigation, learning how to provide alternative explanations that were more palatable than the truth, how to redirect suspicion toward more convenient targets, and how to use his authority to discourage further inquiry into cases that might threaten his activities. One particularly detailed journal entry described how Sheriff Kittredge had handled the investigation into Meridian Hartwell's death. He had arrived at the scene before anyone else, allowing him to arrange evidence to support his predetermined conclusion of accidental drowning. He had coached Josiah Hartwell on what to say to investigators, emphasizing the importance of mentioning the foggy weather and Meridian's recent emotional instability. He had even suggested specific details that Josiah should include in his statement, creating a narrative that was both believable and legally sufficient to close the case without further investigation. The journals revealed that Sheriff Kittredge had targeted several specific types of victims over the years. Transients and drifters represented his preferred targets because their disappearances could be easily explained and were unlikely to generate sustained investigation. However, he had also eliminated locals who had become suspicious of his activities or who posed other types of threats to his continued operations. In some cases, Sheriff Kittredge had cultivated relationships with potential victims over extended periods, gaining their trust and learning about their habits and vulnerabilities before striking. He had posed as a helpful law enforcement officer, offering assistance with various problems and gradually maneuvering victims into situations where they could be isolated and controlled without witnesses or interference. The journals also documented Sheriff Kittredge's efforts to maintain his facade of respectability within the community. He had deliberately cultivated relationships with civic leaders, religious figures, and prominent citizens, understanding that their support and testimony would provide protection against suspicion or accusation. He had volunteered for community organizations, participated in charitable activities, and maintained the appearance of a dedicated public servant who was above reproach. Detective Hartwell found evidence that Sheriff Kittredge had been careful to vary his methods and timing to avoid creating recognizable patterns that might attract attention from outside law enforcement agencies. He had studied crime statistics and investigative procedures from other jurisdictions, learning from the mistakes of criminals who had been caught. Because they became predictable or careless. The basement also contained evidence of Sheriff Kittredge's preparation for eventual discovery or retirement from his activities. He had apparently been planning his exit strategy for several years, gradually moving resources and preparing alternative identities that would allow him to disappear if his crimes were exposed. The anonymous letter that had triggered the current investigation was part of this plan, allowing him to control the timing and circumstances of his exposure while creating a diversion that would facilitate his escape. Detective Hartwell spent hours in the basement photographing evidence and trying to comprehend the scope of Sheriff Kittredge's crimes. The careful documentation, the preserved trophies, and the methodical progression of techniques indicated someone who had viewed violence as a craft to be perfected rather than a crime to be hidden. The journals contained detailed analyses of victims' responses to different types of pain, written with the detached curiosity of a researcher studying laboratory specimens. As dawn approached, Detective Hartwell finally left the basement and drove back toward town, his mind racing with the implications of what he had discovered. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. But he understood that arresting and prosecuting a respected sheriff would require careful coordination with state and federal authorities. The investigation would have to be conducted with absolute secrecy to prevent Sheriff Kittredge from learning about the discovery and potentially fleeing or destroying additional evidence. The drive back to Jasper gave Detective Hartwell time to consider the broader implications of the case. If Sheriff Kittredge had been operating undetected for nearly 20 years, it raised serious questions about oversight and accountability in rural law enforcement. How many other isolated communities might be harboring similar predators in positions of authority? How many other missing persons cases might have been inadequately investigated because the investigators themselves were responsible for the disappearances? Detective Hartwell also thought about the victims and their families, particularly those who had accepted official explanations for deaths and disappearances that had actually been murders. The families of transients might never learn the truth about what had happened to their loved ones, while local families would have to confront the devastating knowledge that they had trusted their safety to someone who had been their greatest threat. When Detective Hartwell arrived in Jasper, he found the town beginning to wake up for another ordinary day. Early risers were opening businesses, starting coffee, and preparing for the routines that had sustained the community for decades. None of them suspected that their trusted sheriff was a predator who had been hunting among them for 20 years, or that their peaceful community was about to be shattered by revelations that would challenge everything they believed about safety, authority, and trust. Detective Hartwell went directly to the courthouse to confront Sheriff Kittredge, but the sheriff's office was empty. According to the dispatcher, Sheriff Kittredge had called in early that morning to report that he would be investigating a property dispute in a remote area of the county and would be out of radio contact for most of the day. The dispatcher seemed unconcerned by this explanation, as Sheriff Kittredge frequently worked alone in isolated areas where radio communication was unreliable. However, Detective Hartwell noticed that Sheriff Kittredge's personal effects had been removed from his office. The photographs, certificates, and personal items that had decorated the walls and desk the previous day were gone, leaving only the basic furniture and equipment that belonged to the county. The gun case was empty, and the filing cabinets appeared to have been cleared of personal documents. A search of Sheriff Kittredge's home revealed that he had left during the night, taking only essential belongings and leaving no indication of his intended destination. Neighbors reported that they had seen lights in the house around midnight, but had assumed that Sheriff Kittredge was simply working late on official business. No one had observed him leaving or noticed anything unusual about his behavior in the preceding days. Sheriff Kittredge's patrol car was found abandoned at a boat launch on the Buffalo River, approximately 15 miles from his home. The vehicle had been carefully cleaned, with all personal items removed, and no fingerprints or other evidence that might indicate where he had gone or how he had left the area. A note left on the dashboard apologized to the people of Newton County and claimed that justice would finally be served, but provided no specific details about his crimes or his intended fate. The note was written in Sheriff Kittredge's distinctive handwriting, but forensic analysis would later reveal that it had been written under extreme stress or while the writer was experiencing significant psychological pressure. The paper showed indentations from heavy pen pressure, and the handwriting exhibited slight tremors and irregularities that suggested the author had been agitated or frightened while writing. The search for Sheriff Kittredge consumed law enforcement resources across multiple states for months. His description was circulated to every police department in the region, and his photograph appeared in newspapers from St. Louis to New Orleans. Federal authorities joined the investigation, as the multi-state nature of the search and the involvement of a corrupt law enforcement officer made the case a federal priority. Several reported sightings placed Sheriff Kittredge in different states at the same time, suggesting either multiple cases of mistaken identity or a carefully planned escape route with multiple false trails. Investigators discovered that Sheriff Kittredge had been withdrawing small amounts of money from various banks over a period of several months, accumulating enough cash to fund an extended period of hiding without leaving a financial trail. The investigation also revealed that Sheriff Kittredge had acquired false identification documents, including a driver's license and Social Security card in a different name. He had apparently been preparing for his eventual disappearance for years, gradually establishing the resources and documentation he would need to start a new life in a different location under a false identity. The basement on Copperhead Ridge yielded evidence linking Sheriff Kittredge to 19 murders spanning nearly 2 decades. The victims were all adults, ranging in age from young transients in their 20s to elderly locals in their 70s, with the only common factors being their vulnerability and isolation. Forensic analysis of the tools and personal items confirmed that each murder had been carefully planned and executed with increasing sophistication over the years. The scope of the investigation expanded as authorities examined cold cases from neighboring counties and states, looking for patterns that might indicate additional victims or related crimes. Several unsolved disappearances and unexplained deaths showed similarities to the confirmed Newton County cases, suggesting that Sheriff Kittredge's activities might have extended beyond his official jurisdiction. The people of Newton County struggled to reconcile the monster revealed by the evidence with the man they had trusted with their safety for 20 years. Many residents found it impossible to accept that their beloved sheriff had been capable of such sustained deception and violence. Some insisted that the evidence had been planted, that Sheriff Kittredge was being framed by someone with unknown motives. Others began to re-examine every interaction they had ever had with Sheriff Kittredge, looking for signs they might have missed. Conversations that had seemed normal at the time took on sinister new meanings when viewed in the context of his true nature. Acts of kindness and protection were reinterpreted as possible manipulation or cover for his real activities. Abilene Crow, who ran the general store in Ponca, remembered how Sheriff Kittredge had always asked detailed questions about strangers who stopped for supplies. She had thought he was being protective of the community, but now she wondered if he had been hunting for victims. The sheriff had seemed particularly interested in transients who were traveling alone, who had no fixed destination, and who had little money or resources. Josiah Bunting, who operated the only gas station in the county seat, recalled how Sheriff Kittredge would sometimes disappear for days at a time, claiming to be visiting relatives in other counties. When contacted by investigators, the relatives had no record of any visits from Sheriff Kittredge during the times in question. Bunting also remembered that the sheriff had often asked about strangers who bought gas, particularly those who seemed to be passing through the area without specific business in Newton County. Dr. Wendell Taggart, the county coroner who had worked with Sheriff Kittredge on numerous cases, was forced to admit that he had been influenced by the sheriff's assessments when determining causes of death. What had seemed like collaborative law enforcement work was revealed to be a systematic cover-up, with the sheriff guiding the coroner's conclusions to support his fabricated explanations for deaths he had caused. Dr. Taggart's review of his own records revealed several cases where he had accepted Sheriff Kittredge's explanations despite physical evidence that suggested alternative causes of death. The coroner had trusted the sheriff's professional judgment and had not pursued independent investigations that might have revealed inconsistencies in the official narratives. The investigation revealed a network of lies and misdirection that extended far beyond the murders themselves. Sheriff Kittredge had been siphoning money from the county budget for years, using the funds to maintain his secret activities and prepare for his eventual escape. He had falsified reports, destroyed evidence, and manipulated witnesses to protect his reputation and maintain his position of authority. Financial records showed that Sheriff Kittredge had been using county resources to purchase equipment and supplies that were not related to legitimate law enforcement activities. He had also been claiming reimbursement for travel expenses related to fictitious training courses and conferences, using these funds to finance trips that were actually related to his criminal activities. The psychological profile developed by state investigators painted Sheriff Kittredge as a highly intelligent psychopath who had used his war experience and position of authority to mask a profound lack of empathy and an insatiable need for control. His military service, rather than instilling a sense of duty and protection, had apparently provided him with skills and justifications for violence that he brought back to civilian life. Military records revealed that Sheriff Kittredge had served in intelligence and interrogation units during his time in the Pacific Theater, positions that had exposed him to advanced techniques for extracting information through psychological and physical pressure. Fellow veterans who had served with him described him as competent and reliable, but also noted that he had seemed unusually comfortable with the violent aspects of warfare and had shown little emotional response to the suffering of enemy prisoners. The basement workshop suggested that Sheriff Kittredge had viewed his victims as subjects for experimentation rather than human beings. The careful documentation, the preserved trophies, and the methodical progression of his techniques indicated someone who saw violence as a scientific endeavor, constantly seeking to refine his methods and expand his understanding of human limitations. Forensic analysis of the carved wall revealed that the entries had been made over a period of many years, with some carvings showing signs of weathering and age that confirmed they had been created at the times indicated by their dates. The consistency of the handwriting and the evolution of the content provided a clear chronological record of Sheriff Kittredge's development as a predator and his increasing sophistication in avoiding detection. The investigation also uncovered evidence that Sheriff Kittredge had been corresponding with individuals in other states who shared his interests in violence and control. Federal authorities found letters and documents that suggested the existence of a network of like-minded individuals who exchanged information about techniques and methods, though most of these correspondences used coded language that made specific prosecutions difficult. In December 1963, a duck hunter found human remains along a remote stretch of the Buffalo River, approximately 15 miles downstream from where Sheriff Kittredge's patrol car had been discovered. The bones showed evidence of trauma consistent with the tools found in the basement, but they had been in the water too long for positive identification using the forensic techniques available at the time. The remains were examined by forensic experts from the State Crime Laboratory, who determined that they belonged to an adult of approximately Sheriff Kittredge's height and build. However, the condition of the bones made it impossible to determine the exact cause of death or to confirm the identity through dental records or other identifying features. Some investigators believed that the remains belonged to Sheriff Kittredge himself, suggesting that he had taken his own life rather than face capture and trial. This theory was supported by the location of the bones downstream from where his patrol car had been found, and by the evidence of trauma that could have been self-inflicted using one of the weapons he had taken from his office. Other investigators maintained that the remains belonged to another victim, and that Sheriff Kittredge had successfully escaped to begin a new life under a false identity. This theory was supported by evidence of his careful preparation for disappearance, including the acquisition of false identification documents and the accumulation of resources needed to sustain himself while avoiding detection. The remains were buried in the county cemetery under a simple marker reading "Unknown," but many residents believed they were looking at the final resting place of their former sheriff. The funeral was attended by only a few people, as most community members were still struggling to process the revelations about Sheriff Kittredge's true nature and were uncomfortable with any ceremony that might be interpreted as honoring his memory. The uncertainty about Sheriff Kittredge's fate left the community without closure, unable to fully process their trauma or move forward with confidence. Some residents relocated to other areas, feeling that they could never again feel safe in a place where they had been so thoroughly deceived about the nature of the person they had trusted to protect them. Detective Cyrus Hartwell found himself profoundly changed by what he had discovered in that basement. The evidence of sustained deception and violence committed by someone in a position of ultimate trust challenged his faith in law enforcement and his belief in the basic goodness of human nature. He continued to work on the case for several months, but gradually realized that the investigation was consuming his emotional and psychological resources in ways that were affecting his health and his relationships with family and colleagues. 6 months after the initial discovery, Detective Hartwell requested a transfer to a different assignment, citing the need for a change of pace and environment. His superiors granted the request, recognizing that the Newton County case had been unusually traumatic and that Detective Hartwell had performed his duties with distinction under extremely difficult circumstances. Detective Hartwell left law enforcement entirely 2 years later, moving to a small farm outside Little Rock, where he raised cattle and avoided human contact as much as possible. In rare interviews with reporters over the years, he would only say that some truths were too heavy for one person to carry alone, and that his experience in Newton County had taught him that evil could hide behind the most respectable facades. The house on Copperhead Ridge was destroyed by fire in the spring of 1964, apparently the result of an electrical malfunction in the old wiring that had not been maintained since the Hartwell family's departure. The fire burned so hot that it cracked the limestone foundation and collapsed the basement walls, burying the carved confessions under tons of rubble and ash. Local firefighters made no attempt to save the structure, arriving only to ensure that the flames did not spread to the surrounding forest. The decision to let the house burn was influenced by the community's desire to eliminate any physical reminder of the horrors that had been discovered there, as well as practical considerations about the cost and difficulty of maintaining emergency services in such a remote location. Several items were recovered from the ruins before the fire completely destroyed the structure, including metal tools from the basement workshop and fragments of the journals that had documented Sheriff Kittredge's crimes. These pieces of evidence were stored in a state police evidence locker, where they remained until 1968, when they were transferred to an archive facility that was later damaged by flooding. The official explanation for the loss of evidence was that a burst water main had damaged multiple storage areas, destroying thousands of documents and physical items that were being held for various ongoing and closed investigations. However, some investigators suspected that the destruction was deliberate, an attempt to finally erase the last traces of a case that had embarrassed law enforcement agencies across Arkansas and raised uncomfortable questions about oversight and accountability in rural jurisdictions. The flooding incident was investigated by internal affairs personnel who concluded that the damage was accidental and that no evidence of deliberate sabotage could be found. However, the investigation was limited in scope and duration, and some observers noted that several key witnesses and personnel were transferred to other assignments before they could be thoroughly interviewed about the circumstances surrounding the evidence destruction. The people of Newton County gradually attempted to move on with their lives, but the betrayal by their trusted sheriff left psychological and emotional scars that persisted for years. Property values in the county declined as families decided to relocate to areas where they might feel safer and more secure. The few businesses in the county seat struggled as tourism decreased, and younger adults left for opportunities in larger cities where the past was not so heavily weighted with hidden horrors. Some families left the county entirely, selling their land for whatever they could get, and starting over in places where they would not be constantly reminded of their vulnerability to deception and manipulation by authority figures. These families often found it difficult to explain their decision to leave without revealing details about the case that they preferred not to discuss, leading to strained relationships with friends and extended family members who did not understand their motivations. Others remained in Newton County, determined to rebuild their community's reputation and prove that the actions of one man did not define an entire place. These residents worked to strengthen community organizations, improve communication and cooperation among neighbors, and create new traditions and institutions that would help heal the psychological wounds left by Sheriff Kittredge's crimes. The case influenced changes in law enforcement oversight and accountability measures across Arkansas and other rural states. Sheriff's departments were required to implement new reporting procedures, submit to regular audits, and participate in training programs designed to identify and prevent the kind of systematic deception that had allowed Sheriff Kittredge to operate undetected for nearly 20 years. These reforms included requirements for periodic psychological evaluations of law enforcement personnel, improved communication and coordination between local and state authorities, and enhanced training for coroners and medical examiners to help them maintain independence from local law enforcement influences when determining causes of death. Federal authorities also used the case as an example when developing new training programs for identifying and investigating corruption within law enforcement organizations. The systematic nature of Sheriff Kittredge's crimes and his sophisticated methods for avoiding detection became case study material for FBI training courses and academic research into criminal behavior among authority figures. In the decades that followed the initial investigation, occasional reports surfaced of someone matching Sheriff Kittredge's description being seen in other states, usually in connection with unexplained disappearances or unusual violent crimes. None of these sightings were ever confirmed through fingerprints, photographs, or other definitive evidence, and many law enforcement professionals believed they were the result of wishful thinking by people who wanted to believe that the missing sheriff was still alive and could be brought to justice. Some of the reported sightings came from other law enforcement officers who claimed to have encountered someone who seemed familiar but could not be positively identified. These reports typically described a man of the right age and general appearance, often in circumstances that suggested familiarity with police procedures and criminal investigation techniques. Other sightings were reported by civilians who had learned about the case through newspaper coverage or word of mouth and believed they had encountered Sheriff Kittredge in various locations across the South and Midwest. These reports were generally considered less reliable, as they often included details that were inconsistent with known facts about Sheriff Kittredge's appearance or behavior. Federal authorities maintained an active investigation file on Sheriff Kittredge for over a decade, but gradually reduced their efforts as leads became less frequent and less credible. The case was never officially closed, but resources were eventually redirected to more recent investigations with better prospects for successful resolution. Academic researchers studying the case identified several factors that had enabled Sheriff Kittredge to operate undetected for such an extended period. His position of authority within a small, isolated community had provided him with unique opportunities to identify potential victims, control criminal investigations, and influence the interpretation of evidence by other officials. The social dynamics of rural Newton County had also contributed to Sheriff Kittredge's success in avoiding detection. The community's strong preference for handling problems internally without outside interference had discouraged residents from reporting suspicions to state or federal authorities who might have been able to investigate more objectively. The case also highlighted the vulnerability of transient populations who had comprised many of Sheriff Kittredge's victims. These individuals often lacked strong social connections or advocacy networks that might have pressed for more thorough investigations when they disappeared. Their marginalized status made them attractive targets for predators who understood that their disappearances were unlikely to generate sustained attention from law enforcement or media. Psychological analysis of Sheriff Kittredge's behavior revealed a sophisticated understanding of human nature and social dynamics that had allowed him to manipulate both victims and colleagues effectively. He had recognized that people wanted to trust authority figures and had exploited this natural tendency to avoid suspicion while identifying and accessing potential victims. The methodical nature of his crimes and the careful documentation found in the basement suggested someone who viewed violence as both an intellectual challenge and a source of personal satisfaction. The progression from impulsive early crimes to carefully planned later murders showed a learning process that had allowed Sheriff Kittredge to become increasingly effective while reducing his risk of detection. Detective Cyrus Hartwell died in 1989 at the age of 73, taking with him detailed knowledge of aspects of the case that were never made public. In his personal papers, discovered after his death, he had continued to research similar unsolved cases across the rural South, looking for patterns that might indicate other law enforcement officers who had used their positions to commit crimes. His research files contained correspondence with investigators in other states, newspaper clippings about unusual disappearances and unexplained deaths, and analysis of statistical patterns in crime reporting from various rural jurisdictions. The overall impression was of someone who had been deeply affected by what he had learned about the potential for corruption and abuse within law enforcement systems. Detective Hartwell's research suggested that the Newton County case was not an isolated incident, but part of a larger pattern of predatory behavior by authority figures in isolated communities where oversight was limited and accountability mechanisms were weak. His findings were never published or formally presented to law enforcement agencies, as he had apparently lost faith in institutional solutions to problems that he viewed as fundamental flaws in human nature. The anonymous letter that had initiated the investigation was never fully explained, despite extensive analysis by handwriting experts and forensic specialists. While the letter had definitely been written by Sheriff Kittredge himself, the motivation for exposing his own crimes remained a subject of speculation among investigators and psychological profilers. One theory suggested that Sheriff Kittredge had suffered a psychological breakdown and was no longer able to maintain his facade of normalcy while continuing his criminal activities. The stress of maintaining deception for nearly 20 years, combined with the increasing sophistication required to avoid detection as investigative techniques improved, might have created psychological pressure that manifested as a compulsion to confess. Another theory proposed that Sheriff Kittredge had learned about the scheduled state audit of county records and had realized that his financial irregularities would eventually be discovered. Rather than wait to be exposed through routine administrative procedures, he had decided to control the narrative by revealing his more serious crimes while simultaneously creating an opportunity to escape before he could be arrested. A third theory, supported by entries in his journals, suggested that Sheriff Kittredge had grown bored with his activities and wanted to create one final, elaborate deception that would allow him to disappear while law enforcement searched for a dead man. This theory proposed that he had always planned to escape, viewing the exposure of his crimes as another form of manipulation designed to serve his own purposes. The truth about Sheriff Kittredge's motivations may never be known with certainty, as the psychological complexity revealed by his journals and other evidence suggests someone capable of operating on multiple levels simultaneously, pursuing both conscious and unconscious goals through carefully planned actions that served several purposes at once. The fate of Sheriff Ambrose Kittredge also remains uncertain, despite decades of investigation and speculation. The human remains found in the Buffalo River could have belonged to him or to another victim whose identity was lost when supporting evidence was destroyed in the 1968 flooding incident. Modern DNA analysis might have resolved the question, but the bones had been buried without preservation of tissue samples, and the cemetery records were inadequate to locate the grave for exhumation. Occasional reported sightings of Sheriff Kittredge continued sporadically throughout the 1970s and 1980s, but became less frequent as time passed, and his distinctive appearance would have changed with age. Some law enforcement officials believed that he had died shortly after his disappearance, either by self-inflicted violence or accident, while others maintained that he had successfully assumed a new identity and was living quietly somewhere beyond the reach of justice. The basement on Copperhead Ridge, with its carved confessions and carefully organized tools, had represented something that the people of Newton County found almost impossible to accept. That evil could wear a familiar face, speak with a trusted voice, and hide behind symbols of authority and protection. The revelation that their sheriff had been their greatest threat forced the community to confront fundamental questions about the nature of trust, safety, and social order. The case challenged basic assumptions about how communities protect themselves and evaluate the people they place in positions of authority. Sheriff Kittredge had not been a stranger or outsider who had infiltrated their community. He had been one of them, born and raised in their county, educated in their schools and shaped by their values and traditions. His transformation into a predator suggested that evil was not an external threat that could be identified and excluded, but a potential that existed within the community itself. The psychological impact on Newton County residents was profound and long-lasting. Many adults reported difficulty sleeping, increased anxiety about personal safety, and persistent doubts about their ability to judge the character and intentions of others. The knowledge that they had been deceived so completely by someone they had trusted implicitly created a lasting sense of vulnerability and uncertainty that affected their relationships with neighbors, authorities, and even family members. The economic impact on Newton County was also significant, as the negative publicity associated with the case discouraged tourism and business development that might have provided employment opportunities for residents. The county's reputation was permanently associated with the crimes, making it difficult to attract new residents or investment that might have helped the community recover and rebuild. Local businesses struggled as fewer people were willing to visit the area, and property values declined as families decided to relocate to places that did not carry the psychological burden of association with Sheriff Kittredge's crimes. The population of the county continued to decline over subsequent decades, with younger adults leaving for opportunities elsewhere and older residents passing away without being replaced by new families. Today, the site where the Hartwell House once stood is marked only by a slight depression in the forest floor and some scattered foundation stones that are gradually being reclaimed by vegetation. The dirt road that once provided access to the property has been completely overgrown, and few people remember exactly where it was located or would be able to find it without detailed maps and significant effort. The county government has worked deliberately to overcome the negative associations with Sheriff Kittredge's crimes, promoting Newton County's natural beauty, recreational opportunities, and outdoor activities while avoiding any reference to the dark chapter in its history. Tourism marketing emphasizes the area's pristine forests, clear streams, and abundant wildlife, presenting it as a peaceful retreat from urban stress and complexity. But the legacy of Sheriff Ambrose Kittredge continues to influence how law enforcement operates in rural communities across Arkansas and other states. His ability to use his position of trust to commit crimes undetected for nearly 20 years fundamentally changed how oversight agencies monitor isolated sheriff's departments and how communities evaluate the people they choose to protect them. Modern law enforcement training programs include case studies based on Sheriff Kittredge's methods and the systematic failures that allowed him to operate without detection for so long. These programs emphasize the importance of independent oversight, regular psychological evaluation of personnel, and communication systems that allow citizens to report concerns about official misconduct to agencies outside the local jurisdiction. The case also influenced the development of improved forensic techniques and evidence preservation procedures designed to prevent the kind of evidence destruction that occurred in 1968. Modern crime laboratories maintain multiple backup copies of critical evidence and use computer databases that are more difficult to manipulate or destroy than the paper-based filing systems that were standard in the 1960s. On quiet nights in Newton County, when the wind moves through the oak and hickory trees that have reclaimed Copperhead Ridge, some longtime residents claim they can still sense echoes of the past, the weight of hidden secrets, the presence of unresolved evil, and the persistent question of whether justice was ever truly served. These feelings may be nothing more than the natural human response to a landscape marked by tragedy, but they serve as reminders that some wounds never completely heal. The most terrifying aspect of the Sheriff Kittredge case was not the violence he committed, but the skill with which he deceived an entire community for 2 decades. He had understood that people needed to trust their protectors and had weaponized that trust, turning it into a tool for identifying victims and avoiding detection. His crimes had been enabled not by the weakness or stupidity of his victims and neighbors, but by their fundamental humanity and their natural desire to believe in safety and justice. The people of Newton County had not been naive. They had been human, with all the vulnerabilities and blind spots that accompany the social bonds that make communities possible. Sheriff Kittredge had exploited these vulnerabilities systematically, using his intimate knowledge of human psychology and community dynamics to maintain his facade while satisfying his need for control and violence. The case remains a sobering reminder that the most dangerous predators are often those who appear most trustworthy, who understand the systems designed to protect society, and who are willing and able to corrupt those systems for their own purposes. It challenges comfortable assumptions about the nature of evil and forces recognition that safety is often more fragile and more dependent on trust than people want to acknowledge. In the end, the truth about what happened in that basement on Copperhead Ridge may be less important than the questions the case raises about authority, trust, and the price of social order. Sheriff Ambrose Kittredge may have died in 1963, or he may have lived for decades under another name, but his legacy persists in the form of improved oversight, enhanced training, and a deeper understanding of how evil can hide behind badges and uniforms. The people who lived through the revelation of Sheriff Kittredge's crimes carried that knowledge with them for the rest of their lives, passing down to subsequent generations a hard-earned wisdom about the importance of vigilance, the necessity of independent oversight, and the recognition that trust, once broken, can never be completely restored. Their experience serves as both a warning and a memorial to those who died unrecognized and unmourned in a basement that has long since returned to the earth that surrounds it.